Serafina Villalobos stood by the tilted wooden post of her front fence, her fingers curled tightly around a heavy clay pitcher filled with cool water from the backyard well. The evening sun was sinking fast over the gentle rolling hills of San Miguel, a quiet, sun-baked ranching town nestled in the heart of the Texas hill country. The horizon burned like a dying ember, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dry pasture, the creaking blades of the old wooden windmill, and the small herd of cattle grazing near the creek bed. For most people in the county, twilight was the peaceful hour when the day's burdens were laid down. But for Serafina, it was the time when terror crept out of the dark. Serafina was 42 years old and had lived alone on the ranch for 3 long years, ever since her husband passed away. The land had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations, a stretch of hard, stubborn soil that required sweat and grit to keep alive. She was a woman of lean strength, with dark hair silvering at the temples, hands roughened by daily labor, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. As she stood near the edge of the dirt road, the rhythmic thud of approaching horse hooves made her chest tighten instantly. Her first instinct, forged by 3 years of isolation and anxiety, was to run inside, throw the heavy iron latch across the front door, and grab her shotgun. A stranger riding down a deserted country road at dusk rarely brought good news to a widow living miles from town. Any other day, she would have fled into the safety of the dark house. But something about the approaching silhouette kept her rooted to the dusty earth. Out of the golden haze rode a solitary man. He sat low in the saddle, his broad-brimmed leather hat pulled down low over his eyes, his shoulders stooped with a weight that went beyond physical tiredness. His bay horse moved with slow, weary steps, its coat caked in gray road dust. The pair looked as though they had ridden from the far edge of the world, dragging miles of silence and suffering behind them. As the horse reached the fence, the rider pulled gently on the reins. The bay stopped, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. The stranger raised 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, in an old-fashioned gesture of courtesy that had long fallen out of favor in the modern world. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said. His voice was raspy and low, like dry leaves scraping across stones. "I don't mean to intrude on your property. My horse and I have been traveling since dawn without a rest. Would you be kind enough to let me draw a bucket of water from your well?" Serafina studied his face with the sharp intuition of someone whose survival depended on reading human intent. He had a weather-beaten face, several days of salt and pepper stubble, and eyes that were deeply sunken. Yet there was no cruelty in his gaze. She knew the hard, predatory look of bad men. She had seen it up close in recent weeks. This man's eyes held only a profound, quiet sorrow, the look of someone who had lost everything he ever cared about and was simply going through the motions of staying alive. Without saying a word, she stepped forward and lifted the heavy clay pitcher over the wooden rail. "It is fresh from the well," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Drink your fill first, mister. Then we can take care of your horse." The stranger looked surprised, hesitating for a second as if he were no longer accustomed to receiving simple kindness from strangers. He dismounted heavily, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a soft thud. As he reached out to take the pitcher, his rough fingers brushed against hers. Serafina felt the calluses on his palm, the hands of a man who knew hard, physical labor, who knew how to handle tools, ropes, and the stubborn realities of rural life. He drank slowly, keeping his eyes closed, savoring the cool liquid as if it were a rare blessing. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and handed the pitcher back. "May the Lord bless you for this, ma'am," he murmured softly. "You have no idea what a cold drink means after a full day under that scorching Texas sun." It was at that exact moment that something inside Serafina broke. For 3 years, she had guarded her words, her emotions, and her safety with absolute caution. A lone widow on an isolated ranch could not afford weakness. But looking at this tired stranger in the fading light, the heavy boulder of despair she had carried in silence finally shattered her composure. "I live alone," she blurted out, her voice trembling before she could stop herself. She hated the weakness in her tone, but the words poured out of her like a flood breaking through a dam. "I am entirely alone on this ranch. My husband died 3 years ago, and I've been trying to hold on to this land by myself ever since." She swallowed hard, trying to catch her breath. "For the past month, men have been coming onto my property under the cover of dark. They are stealing my cattle. 9 cows are gone already, 9 of my finest head. I go out on the porch with my double-barrel shotgun. I fire into the air, and I scream into the dark. But I am just one woman against a pack of wolves. Any night now, they are going to realize there is no one here to fight them off. And then—" Her voice cracked completely, and she turned her head away in shame, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with her sleeve. She took a deep breath, collecting whatever pride she had left, and looked back at the man. "I need a man to protect this place," she confessed softly, "even if it's only for a few days. I don't have much money, but I can offer you a warm bed in the bunkhouse, 3 hot meals a day, and whatever modest wages I can afford. You look like a man of your word, mister, and I simply cannot do this by myself anymore." The stranger stood in complete silence. He looked past her shoulder at the humble white ranch house, the rusted windmill, the quiet pastures, and the handful of cattle scattered near the trees. When he turned his brown eyes back to her, Serafina saw a shadow of deep pain pass over his features, as though the word protection had reopened an ancient, unhealed wound. "My name is Nicanor, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it has been a very long time since I had anyone left to protect." He did not give her an immediate yes, but he did not climb back onto his horse either. And as the dark settled over the Texas hills, Serafina knew in her heart that the weary traveler who had stopped only for a drink of water would not be riding away that night. To understand why Serafina Villalobos placed her trust in a total stranger that evening, one must look back at the quiet tragedy that had stripped her life of joy. Things had not always been so desperate on the ranch. There was a time when the property was full of laughter, hard work, and shared dreams. For 19 years, Serafina had been married to Samuel Villalobos, a gentle giant of a man with a booming laugh and hands large enough to cradle a newborn calf with absolute delicacy. Samuel was the kind of man who could calm a wild stallion simply by speaking to it in a low, rhythmic murmur. People from all over San Miguel County said there was no rancher who understood cattle better than Samuel. Serafina had adored him with a quiet, deep devotion that showed itself in the small details of daily life. A hot pot of black coffee waiting on the stove at dawn, mended work shirts neatly folded, and hands reaching for one another in the dark before sleep. Their only sorrow was that despite years of praying, they were never blessed with children. Everything changed on a cool Tuesday morning 3 years ago. Samuel had purchased a magnificent but wild young bull to improve the ranch's breeding stock. He was working in the main corral, trying to halter the beast, while Serafina was inside the kitchen kneading bread dough. A sudden, chaotic shout from the hired hands brought her running outside, her hands still white with flour. She arrived just in time to witness the final seconds of the nightmare. It took only a fraction of an instant, the brief moment it takes a 1,200-pound animal to turn, for 19 years of shared life to be erased. The bull charged, Samuel slipped in the damp mud of the corral, and before anyone could intervene, he was gone. The doctor told her afterward that he hadn't suffered, that it had been over in a heartbeat, as if the speed of the tragedy could somehow lessen the crushing weight of her grief. She buried Samuel on the high, grassy ridge overlooking the pastures, right beneath the shade of an old oak tree where he used to sit and watch the sunset. After the funeral, the hard realities of rural life set in quickly. Without a male owner to guarantee wages, the hired hands slowly drifted away to find steady work elsewhere. Serafina held no bitterness toward them. A man had to feed his family. But every hand that rode away took another piece of her stability with him. Soon, she was left completely alone with 60 head of cattle, a broken windmill, miles of wooden fencing to repair, and only her 2 hands to manage it all. Against all odds, she survived. She learned how to wrangle cattle from horseback, how to treat sick calves, and how to sleep with a shotgun leaning against her nightstand. She worked from 4 in the morning until late at night, collapsing into bed only when her body could no longer move. Every evening, she would look up at the oak tree on the ridge and whisper into the darkness, "It was a tough day today, Samuel, but I held the fort for one more day." It didn't take long for the men from town to notice her situation. Some came with good intentions, but most viewed a lone widow with valuable land as easy prey. 6 months after Samuel's death, an ambitious local bachelor offered her marriage, though he spoke far more about the ranch's acreage than he did about affection. Another dishonest neighbor offered protection in exchange for land rights that made her want to throw him off her porch. She ran them all off. Serafina built high walls around her heart and learned to trust no one. Then came the rustlers. It started a month ago. At first, she thought she had miscounted her herd, but the next morning, 2 more cows were gone. She found cut barbed wire at the edge of her property and wagon tracks leading off into the brush. These were not strays. They were thieves taking advantage of her isolation. She began staying up all night, sitting on the porch with her shotgun across her knees, running blindly into the dark whenever she heard a suspicious noise, firing shots into the air to scare them off. It worked a few times, but she was fighting a losing battle. 9 cows were gone. Losing her herd meant financial ruin, and financial ruin meant losing the ranch, the land Samuel and his father had poured their lives into. Worse than the economic loss was the paralyzing fear that gripped her every time the sun went down. She was miles from the nearest neighbor, entirely unprotected, and aware that desperate men in dark places eventually grow bolder. When Nicanor rode up to her fence, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in any other man who had approached her ranch in 3 years: absolute honesty and a shared understanding of grief. That first evening, as the shadows lengthened and Nicanor unsaddled his horse in the barn, Serafina watched him from the kitchen window. The way he handled his horse revealed everything about his character. He moved without sudden gestures or anger, brushing down the bay's sweaty coat with a quiet, practiced tenderness. He spoke to the animal in soft, reassuring tones that reminded her painfully of Samuel. "There's fresh water in the trough," Serafina called out as she walked down the barn aisle, carrying a lantern, "and plenty of good hay in the stall." "Thank you, ma'am," Nicanor replied, carefully checking the horse's hooves. Poor fellow picked up a sharp stone in his shoe a few miles back. That's why he was limping. He pulled a small pocket knife from his trousers and skillfully pried the stone loose. The horse gave a soft whinny of relief and rested its nose against Nicanor's shoulder. Nicanor patted its neck gently. "There you go, old friend. All better." Serafina leaned against the wooden post, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Where do you come from, Nicanor? If you don't mind me asking." The man straightened up slowly and removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair streaked with silver at the temples. Without the hat brim hiding his face, Serafina could see his features clearly. He had a strong jaw, weathered skin, and eyes that were remarkably kind, yet filled with a deep, lingering sorrow. "From nowhere in particular, ma'am," he admitted quietly. "I've been on the road for 4 years now, moving from one ranch to another across Texas and New Mexico. Working a roundup here, repairing fences there. When the job is done, I pack up my saddlebags and move along. I don't stay in one place." "Why is that?" The question slipped out before she could catch herself. Nicanor looked down at the wooden hat in his hands, turning it slowly. Outside, the night was quiet, save for the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of the wind through the tall grass. "Because staying hurts, ma'am," he said softly, his voice thick with unspoken memories. "You stay in a place, and you start caring about the land, the walls, the people. And I decided a long time ago that I don't want to care about anything ever again. Attachment is what breaks you when it gets taken away. The open road is easier, because when you own nothing and belong nowhere, you have nothing left to lose." Serafina listened in complete silence. She understood that kind of emotional armor all too well. She had stayed on her land, but she had built invisible walls around herself to keep the world out. 2 different ways of escaping the exact same pain. "What did you lose, Nicanor?" she asked gently. The man sat down on an overturned wooden crate, staring at the lantern light flickering on the dirt floor. The heavy silence of 4 years of solitary grief seemed to lift just enough for him to speak. "I had my own place once," he began, his voice barely audible. "A small, humble ranch up near the Panhandle. It wasn't big, but it was mine. My father and I built the cabin with our own hands. After he passed, I kept it going. When I was 38, I met a woman named Clara at a county fair. She was the purest, sweetest soul I ever knew, ma'am. She had a smile that could brighten up the darkest room. We got married, and she moved out to the ranch with me. Those were the happiest years of my life. The only good years, truth be told." He paused, swallowing hard, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his hat. "A year later, she was expecting our first child. You cannot imagine the joy that filled our little home. I spent every evening after work carving a wooden cradle, sanding it down so smooth there wasn't a single rough edge on it. Clara spent her afternoons sewing baby clothes. We argued softly about names, laughing together in the kitchen. We had everything, ma'am. Everything." Serafina held her breath, knowing the dark shadow that was about to fall over his story. "When the day came for the baby to arrive," Nicanor continued, his voice trembling violently, "complications set in. The local midwife couldn't handle it. I rode like a madman to town to fetch the doctor, but the distance was too great, and the roads were washed out from rain. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was too late. I lost them both that night, Clara and our unborn son." Tears welled up in Serafina's eyes, overflowing onto her cheeks. She didn't bother wiping them away. "I walked into that bedroom," Nicanor whispered, staring blankly at the floorboards. "And there they were, completely still. And I just stood in the doorway, paralyzed. A grown man who could break wild horses and clear timber, standing in a doorway, unable to take a single step forward to hold his wife. I felt like a lost, terrified child. "I am so sorry, Nicanor," Serafina said from the bottom of her heart. "After I buried them under the willow tree behind the house," he said, his voice going completely flat, "nothing mattered anymore. I stopped working the land. A brutal drought hit the region the following year, and my cattle died one by one. I just watched them die without lifting a finger. What was the point? Why save a ranch when there is no family left to share it with?" The bank eventually took the land to pay off the mortgage, the land my father built, where Clara and my boy were buried. That's what haunts me most, ma'am. Not losing the house or the cattle. Land belongs to God, anyway. What breaks my soul is that strangers live in that house now, and I can't even lay a flower on my wife's grave without being chased off for trespassing. That's why I keep moving. Because the moment I stop, I remember. And when I remember, the pain is unbearable. Serafina looked at him, feeling a deep, profound connection to this broken man. "My husband died 3 years ago," she shared softly. "A bull crushed him in the corral. In a single second, 19 years of marriage evaporated. We couldn't have children either, so I was left entirely alone. I know what it feels like to talk to an empty house, Nicanor. I know how heavy it is to wake up every morning and have to relive the nightmare all over again." Nicanor looked up at her, and for the first time, a subtle change passed over his weathered face. It wasn't a smile, but the hard tension around his eyes softened just a fraction. "It seems God has a way of bringing broken people together, ma'am," he murmured. "My name is Serafina," she corrected him gently. "Please, call me Serafina." "Serafina," he repeated, testing the name softly. "It's a graceful name." Serafina felt a sudden warmth color her cheeks, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Embarrassed, she cleared her throat and stood up. "You must be starving. I'm going to heat up some stew and cornbread. You can sleep in the bunkhouse behind the barn. It's simple, but it's clean and dry. We can talk about the cattle tomorrow." "Serafina," Nicanor called out as she turned toward the door. She stopped and looked back. "I haven't promised to stay yet." Serafina's heart sank slightly, but she nodded in understanding. "I know. I won't force you into anything. If you decide to ride away tomorrow morning, I won't hold it against you. You've already done me a kindness just by listening." Nicanor looked out at the dark pastures where the rustlers lurked, then looked at the lone woman holding the lantern, exhausted, terrified, yet standing tall against the world. "I've spent 4 years running away from anything that required my care," he confessed slowly. "And for 4 years, I've been dying inside because of it. Maybe there's a reason my horse brought me to your gate tonight. I'll stay, Serafina. I'll stay and protect your ranch. I can't promise you forever, but as long as those men are targeting your cattle, you have my word. I won't leave you to face them alone." Seats. In the dim lantern light, Serafina felt the heavy weight in her chest lighten for the first time in 3 years. "Thank you, Nicanor," she whispered, her eyes shining with quiet tears of relief. "Thank you." During his first night on the ranch, Nicanor did not sleep a wink. After finishing a hot plate of beef stew and thick cornbread in the kitchen, eating with the quiet, restrained hunger of a man who hadn't enjoyed a homemade meal in months, he declined the bed in the bunkhouse. Instead, he retrieved his lever-action Winchester rifle from his saddlebags, cleaned the barrel by the light of an oil lamp, and stepped out onto the front porch. "What are you doing?" Serafina asked, standing in the doorway wrapped in a woolen shawl. You said they come at night, Nicanor replied, without turning around, his eyes scanning the pitch-black horizon. If they come tonight, they'll find someone waiting for them. Go inside and get some rest, Serafina. You look like you haven't slept in weeks. I'll keep watch. Serafina hesitated, unnerved by the thought of sleeping while a stranger sat on her porch. But the sheer fatigue accumulated over months of terror finally won out. She went to her bedroom, lay down on top of the covers fully dressed with her shotgun beside her, and closed her eyes. Listening to the distant creak of the windmill and the faint, reassuring sound of Nicanor's boots shifting on the porch steps, she drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had known since Samuel died. Out on the porch, Nicanor sat in the dark, the cold steel of his rifle resting across his knees. He looked up at the vast Texas sky, brilliant with thousands of sharp stars, and thought of Clara. For the first time in years, the memory of his wife did not bring a wave of bitter anger. Look where I ended up tonight, Clara, he thought quietly. Guarding the cattle of a widow who offered me a cup of water. You always said I was built to protect things. Maybe you were right. Around midnight, his sharp ears caught a faint sound. It was subtle, a noise that anyone unfamiliar with ranch life would have dismissed as the wind. But Nicanor had been raised on cattle land. He heard the faint rustle of dry brush, the muffled snort of a stressed horse, and the distinct metallic snap of wire cutters. The noise came from the far pasture, where the ranch property bordered the thick mesquite woods. Nicanor moved instantly. He slipped off the porch without making a sound, crouching low as he moved through the shadows of the barn and toward the lower pasture. He didn't yell or fire his rifle into the air. Scaring them off tonight meant they would simply return tomorrow. He wanted to see who they were. Reaching the edge of the wooden corral near the woods, Nicanor crouched behind a heavy watering trough and watched. Under the pale moonlight, 3 men were quietly working. They had cut a wide section of barbed wire fence and were carefully maneuvering 2 beef cows toward a hidden wooden wagon parked in the brush. One man stood guard with a rifle, while the other 2 worked in hurried silence, throwing a heavy burlap sack over the cows' heads to keep them from making noise. They moved with practiced efficiency. Nicanor raised his Winchester, bringing the front sight directly onto the chest of the guard. From 30 yards away, he could easily drop the armed man before anyone realized what was happening. Then deal with the other 2. That was the unwritten law of the Texas Range. Rustlers caught in the act were dealt with quickly and permanently. No one would question a man defending a widow's property. His finger tightened against the trigger. But just as he was about to squeeze, a hushed, desperate conversation drifted over the night air. "Hurry it up, Thomas," the man holding the rifle whispered nervously, his eyes darting toward the main house. "The sun will be up in a few hours, and my kids didn't have a bite to eat yesterday. If we get these 2 cows loaded, we can sell the meat in the next town and buy flour and beans for the month." "I'm going as fast as I can, Jesse," the second man replied, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and deep shame. "God forgive me. I never thought I'd turn into a thief. I hate this. I hate every second of this." "We don't have a choice, brother," Jesse whispered back bitterly. "There are no jobs in the entire county. The big ranches aren't hiring. The drought killed the crops, and my youngest girl is sick with fever. I'd rather go to hell for stealing cattle than sit in my cabin and watch my children starve to death." Nicanor froze. His fingers slowly slid off the trigger of his rifle. The cold rage that had filled his chest vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. These were not ruthless, hardened outlaws who stole for profit or pleasure. These were broken, desperate fathers, Men pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance by poverty, doing something terrible simply to keep their children alive. For a man like Nicanor, who had lost his own child before ever hearing him breathe, the agony of a father watching his children suffer was something he understood all too deeply. He could not shoot them, but he could not allow them to rob Serafina either. Taking her cattle would only drag another innocent person down into ruin. Making a split-second decision, Nicanor stepped out from behind the watering trough into the open moonlight, holding his Winchester pointed safely toward the ground. "Drop the ropes and step away from the cattle," Nicanor said, his voice ringing out clear and calm through the quiet night. The three men spun around in terror. Jesse, the guard, instinctively raised his rifle, aiming straight at Nicanor's chest. The air grew instantly razor-thin with tension, two men armed, standing 20 paces apart in the dark. "Don't do it, friend," Nicanor warned softly, keeping his eyes locked on Jesse. "I had my rifle trained on your heart for the last 3 minutes. If I wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead. Lower your gun." Jesse's hands were shaking violently. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "The widow lives here alone. There are no men on this ranch." "There is one now," Nicanor replied smoothly, "and I'm telling you to put the rifle down and let those cows go. You're not going to take another head of cattle off this land." "We can't go back empty-handed," Jesse cried out in desperation, tears gleaming in his eyes under the moonlight. "My family is starving, mister. You don't know what that feels like." "I know what it feels like to lose a child," Nicanor said, taking a slow step forward, showing no fear. "And I know that if I kill you right now, your kids won't just be hungry. They'll be orphans. Listen to me, Jesse. Lower your weapon. Walk away tonight with your hands empty. But tomorrow morning, at first light, I want you to walk up the main road to the ranch house. Leave your rifle at home, come as a man, and speak to the lady who owns this land. There might be honest work here for a man who knows how to handle stock." Jesse stared at Nicanor in total disbelief. "Work? After we tried to steal her herd? Why would you offer me that?" Nicanor looked at the desperate man, his own eyes dark with old grief. "Because 4 years ago, when my world collapsed and I was drowning in despair, nobody offered me a hand. I spent 4 years rotting inside because of it. I'm not going to let your children suffer the same fate. Leave the cattle, Jesse. Come back tomorrow at dawn, and let's start over." A long, heavy silence stretched over the pasture. Finally, Jesse let out a shaky breath and slowly lowered his rifle. He motioned to his companions, who released the cows. The 2 animals trotted gratefully back toward the safety of the herd. "I'll be here at dawn," Jesse said quietly, looking at Nicanor with a mix of wonder and relief. "I give you my word." "I'll be waiting," Nicanor replied. When Serafina woke the next morning, the bright Texas sun was already streaming through her bedroom window. She sat up abruptly, her heart catching in her throat, as she realized she had slept through the entire night without waking once. Panicked that Nicanor might have slipped away, or that the rustlers had struck while she slept, she grabbed her shotgun and ran out onto the front porch. Nicanor was sitting in the wooden chair where she had left him, his eyes closed, his rifle resting across his lap. He looked utterly exhausted, but as he heard her screen door creak open, he opened his eyes and gave her a tired nod. "Morning, Serafina," he said quietly. Did anything happen?" she asked, her eyes searching the peaceful yard. "They came," Nicanor said calmly, sitting up and stretching his stiff back. "Around midnight. 3 of them." Serafina's heart pounded. 3 of them. Did you shoot them? Did they take any cattle? Nicanor shook his head slowly. No cows were taken. The herd is intact. And no, I didn't shoot anyone. He then proceeded to tell her the entire story, how he had stalked the men, heard their desperate conversation about their starving families, and offered Jesse a chance to come back at dawn to ask for work instead of facing a bullet. As the story unfolded, Serafina felt a stormy mix of emotions rising within her. Gratitude quickly turned into shock, and shock flared into sharp indignation. "You did what?" Serafina exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief. "You let the very men who stole 9 of my cows walk away scot-free? And then you invited one of them back to my home to offer him a job?" Nicanor remained calm, accepting her anger without defensive arguments. "Serafina, listen to me." "No, you listen to me, Nicanor," she interrupted, her cheeks burning with frustration. "I asked you to protect my ranch, not to play guardian angel to the criminals who have been terrorizing me for a month. I have spent weeks terrified in my own house, losing sleep, losing cattle, wondering how I was going to pay my taxes and keep this land, and you invite the culprit to my front porch for coffee?" She turned away, wiping a sudden tear of frustration from her eye. The stress of the past month was boiling over. Nicanor stood up slowly and walked over to the porch railing, standing a respectful distance from her. "You have every right to be furious with me," he said in his low, steady voice. "I made a decision on your land without asking you first. That was wrong, and I apologize. But hear me out before you make up your mind." Serafina stayed silent, her back turned to him, but she listened. "I had that man in my crosshairs, Serafina," Nicanor explained softly. "I could have pulled the trigger, killed him, and no court in Texas would have blamed me. But he wasn't a hardened criminal who steals for profit. He's a father whose children haven't eaten in days. I lost my own child, Serafina. I know the absolute madness that takes over a parent's soul when their child is in danger. If I killed that man last night, I would have left 5 innocent children without a father, condemned to starve in a tin shack somewhere. I couldn't live with that on my conscience. Killing him wouldn't fix your problems anyway. Desperate men will keep coming as long as they are starving. To fix a problem like this, you have to offer a way out." Serafina stood motionless. Her anger began to cool, replaced by the uncomfortable weight of truth. His words struck a deep, forgotten chord in her own memory. She remembered her own childhood during the hard winter of 1898, how her father had sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, unable to find work, watching his family starve. She remembered her mother weeping softly in the pantry, and her father whispering in despair, "When hunger grips a home, a good man's honor begins to bend." She turned around slowly to face Nicanor. "What is his name?" she asked quietly. "Jesse," Nicanor replied. "Jesse Miller. And you think he will actually show up?" "I believe he will," Nicanor said. "A man who risks his life to feed his children still has honor left in him." Serafina let out a long, shuddering sigh, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Well, I am going to make a pot of coffee. If he shows up, I will hear what he has to say. But make no mistake, Nicanor, this is my ranch, and the final decision is mine." Nicanor offered a faint, respectful smile. "It's your ranch, Serafina. I'm just here to help." Just as the morning sun reached the top of the oak tree on the ridge, a figure appeared on the dusty road. Jesse Miller walked alone, his head bowed, his hands empty, and his old felt hat held tightly in his fingers. He looked terrified, stepping forward like a man walking toward a firing squad. yet he kept moving until he stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "Good morning, ma'am," Jesse said, his voice barely audible. He looked at Serafina with raw humility. "I am the man who took your cattle. I came here today to ask for your forgiveness and to face whatever justice you see fit." Serafina looked at him closely. He was a young man, barely 30, but his face was weathered far beyond his years. His clothes were patched and threadbare, his boots were worn through at the soles, and his eyes carried the hollow look of severe exhaustion. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his rope. "How many children do you have, Jesse?" Serafina asked firmly. "5, ma'am," Jesse answered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "The oldest is 10, and the youngest is just 2. My wife is bedridden with a lung infection. I lost my job at the lumber mill when it shut down 2 months ago. I looked for work across 3 counties, ma'am. There is nothing out there. When my little girl cried herself to sleep from hunger, I lost my mind. I took your cows. I know it was wrong, and I know it caused you terrible fear. I am so deeply sorry." Serafina looked at Nicanor, who stood quietly beside her, letting her handle the moment entirely. She then looked back at the broken young man standing in her driveway. "What you did was cruel, Jesse," Serafina said, her voice strong and uncompromising. "You made me live in terror in my own home. You stole the very livestock I depend on to survive. I will not pretend it didn't hurt me." She took a breath, softening her tone just a fraction. "But I know what it feels like to watch a family suffer. My father almost lost his way during the hard winter when I was a girl. So, I am going to give you one chance. And only one." Jesse raised his head, staring at her in shock. "I need hands on this ranch," Serafina continued. "There are fences to mend, water lines to clear, and stock to care for. I will pay you a fair wage, enough to put food on your table and buy medicine for your wife. But if I ever catch you taking so much as an egg from this property without asking, you will be off this land forever, and I will hand you over to the sheriff. Do we understand each other?" Jesse dropped to his knees right there in the dirt, clutching his hat to his chest, tears streaming freely down his face. "God bless you, ma'am," he sobbed openly. "God bless your merciful heart. I swear to you on the lives of my children, you will never find a more loyal hand than me. I will work until my hands bleed to make up for what I took." "Get up off the dirt, Jesse," Serafina said, uncomfortable with such dramatic gratitude. "A man who works for me stands on his own 2 feet. Go bring your family here. There is an empty worker's cottage near the barn that hasn't been used in years. It needs cleaning, but it has a sturdy roof and a wood stove. Your wife and children can live there." Within a week, the quiet ranch of San Miguel was transformed. Jesse returned with his family, his pale, sick wife, Mary, and 5 bright-eyed children who looked at the green pastures as if they had arrived in paradise. Jesse also brought along his 2 companions from the night before, Thomas, a quiet, hard-working man, and Toby, an 18-year-old orphan who had been wandering the roads with nowhere to go. Serafina gave all 3 of them work. For 3 years the ranch had been silent, heavy with the gloom of grief. Now the air was filled with the lively sounds of human existence, children laughing as they chased chickens across the yard, the rhythmic ring of hammers repairing wooden fences, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. Mary, nourished by warm meals and cared for with herbal remedies prepared by Serafina, slowly recovered her strength and began helping around the house. In the middle of this newfound vitality was Nicanor. He took charge of the ranch operations with a natural authority and deep skill that amazed Serafina. He organized the men, repaired the long-broken windmill, trained wild horses, and restored neglected pastures. But what touched Serafina's heart most was his kindness toward the people around him. She watched him teach young Toby how to throw a lasso with endless patience. She saw him playing gently with Jesse's young children, lifting them onto horseback with a rare, genuine smile that lit up his weathered face. One evening, as they were stacking firewood outside the kitchen, Nicanor paused and looked out over the sunset-drenched hills. "I haven't slept through the night in 4 years, Serafina," he said softly. "Not since I lost Clara. I used to lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, consumed by regret. But since I came here, I sleep. The moment my head hits the pillow, I am at peace." Serafina laid a piece of oak on the pile and looked up at him. "So do I, Nicanor," she whispered honestly. "I spent 3 years terrified of the dark. Now, I go to sleep knowing you are here. I don't feel alone anymore." Fendu. Their eyes met in the warm orange light of dusk, and an unspoken truth hung between them. A delicate, beautiful connection forged from shared tragedy and restored hope. On a quiet Sunday morning, Serafina walked up the grassy slope of the high ridge behind the ranch. It was the first time in nearly a year that she had visited Samuel's grave. In the early days of her loss, she had come up here every week to weep, but over time, the pain of visiting had become too sharp to bear. She sat down on the dry grass beside the simple wooden cross, plucking away a few weeds that had grown around the base. From this high vantage point, she could look down at the entire ranch. She saw the cattle grazing peacefully near the creek, the repair work on the barn, and Jesse's children playing in the yard. In the distance, Nicanor was leading a bay horse out to the pasture, his tall frame moving with easy strength. "Hello, Samuel," Serafina whispered softly into the gentle breeze. "The ranch is alive again. You wouldn't believe it if you saw it. There are children running through the yard, the pastures are green, and the windmill is pumping fresh water, just like it used to." She paused, her fingers tracing the carved letters of her husband's name on the wooden cross. "There's a man here now, Samuel," she confessed, tears swelling in her eyes. "His name is Nicanor. When you died, I locked my heart, threw away the key, and swore I would live the rest of my days in solitude, to honor your memory. But Nicanor came along. He lost his wife and his child, and his soul was as broken as mine. When I look at him, Samuel, I feel something coming back to life inside me. I feel guilty, like I'm betraying the 19 years we shared." She closed her eyes, listening to the soft rustle of the oak leaves above her head. The wind blew gently across the ridge, caressing her face like a comforting touch. As she sat in the quiet, a deep sense of peace washed over her. She knew in her heart that Samuel, a man who had loved her with unselfish devotion, would never have wanted her to spend the rest of her life suffocating in eternal sorrow. True love does not demand that the living die alongside the dead. It wishes only for their happiness. "Thank you, Samuel," Serafina murmured, smiling softly through her tears. "Thank you for the wonderful years we had. Rest in peace, my love." When she walked back down the ridge, Nicanor was waiting near the corral. He looked at her eyes, reddened from crying, and offered a respectful nod. "I went to see Samuel. Serafina said simply, as she approached him. "How is he?" Nicanor asked gently. "He gave me his blessing," she replied, looking straight into his eyes. Nicanor stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He understood exactly what she meant. That night, sitting under the stars, Nicanor spoke in his mind to Clara, asking for her forgiveness and seeking his own peace. And in the quiet of his soul, he felt the heavy burden of 4 years of grief finally lift away. However, the peaceful sanctuary they were building was about to be put to a severe test. 3 weeks later, 5 armed riders appeared on the dusty road leading to the ranch. They were not desperate fathers looking for food. These were hardened, ruthless men with cold eyes and heavy revolvers strapped to their hips. At their head rode a notorious regional land grabber and outlaw known throughout the county as Blackwood, a cruel man who had spent years intimidating small ranch owners into selling their land for pennies. Nicanor spotted them immediately. He ordered Jesse and the men to get the women and children inside the house, while he stepped out into the middle of the yard, standing tall and unimpressed as the riders pulled up. Serafina appeared on the front porch a moment later, her double-barrel shotgun resting firmly in her arms. "Afternoon, folks," Blackwood said with a sneer, leaning over his saddle horn. "I heard this dead-end ranch suddenly came back to life. I came to inform the widow that this land is now under my protection. Every small rancher in this valley pays me $50 a month, or 10 head of cattle, to make sure no accidents happen to their property." "This ranch doesn't pay protection money to anyone," Nicanor said coldly, stepping between the riders and the porch. "Turn your horses around and leave." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And who are you to tell me what to do, old man? I have 4 armed men behind me. I could burn this place to the ground before the sheriff in town even heard a gunshot." Nicanor took a slow step forward. His eyes, usually so soft and sad, turned as hard and gray as flint. "I spent 4 years wandering these plains with nothing to live for," Nicanor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy murmur that made even Blackwood's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "I have buried my wife and my son. I have faced starvation, drought, and blood. I am a man who has already died once inside, mister, and there is nothing on this earth more dangerous than a man who isn't afraid to die again. If you lay a single finger on this woman, her land, or these people, I will hunt every last one of you down. You might kill me today, but I guarantee I will take you to hell with me before I hit the dirt. Now get off this property." The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood stared into Nicanor's eyes, looking for any sign of hesitation or fear. He found none. Outlaws thrive on scaring those who have something to lose. They have no answer for a man who fears nothing. Blackwood spat onto the dirt, his face twisted in anger, but he slowly reined his horse around. "This isn't over, old man," he spat out. "We'll be back." "We'll be ready," Nicanor replied calmly. Knowing that Blackwood would return with more men, Nicanor spent the next 48 hours fortifying the ranch. He organized Jesse, Thomas, and Toby, setting up defensive positions around the main house and barn. When Blackwood returned 2 days later with a larger crew, expecting an easy fight, he rode straight into a well-planned ambush, organized by a man who knew defensive tactics inside and out. With Serafina firing accurately from the reinforced kitchen window and Nicanor leading the men from the corral, they repelled the attack within minutes. Jesse's young orphan friend, Toby, rode fast to town to alert the county sheriff, who arrived with a posse of local ranchers just as Blackwood's gang was attempting to retreat. Blackwood and his men were arrested on the spot, bringing an end to years of terror in San Miguel County. In the weeks that followed the final battle, the ranch entered a golden era of peace and prosperity. The story of how a brave widow and a solitary traveler had forgiven a cattle thief, built a thriving community, and stood up to outlaws spread throughout the Texas Hill Country. As spring arrived, turning the dry hills into a vibrant sea of bluebonnets and wildflowers, Nicanor and Serafina were married in the small wooden chapel in town. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Jesse, Mary, their 5 children, and the neighboring ranching families who had come to respect them deeply. Jesse served as Nicanor's best man, standing proud and clean-cut in a new suit, his eyes shining with gratitude for the woman who had saved his life by offering him a job instead of a bullet. Mary dressed Serafina's hair with fresh white blossoms, weeping tears of pure joy for her dear friend. Standing before the altar, Nicanor took Serafina's work-roughened hand in his. "I lost everything once, Serafina," he whispered, looking into her eyes with boundless tenderness. "I thought my life was over, but you gave me a glass of water on a dusty evening and you gave me back my soul. I will love you and protect you for all the days of my life." "And I will love you, Nicanor," Serafina replied softly, her heart full to overflowing. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife. Over the years, the property grew into one of the most successful ranches in the county, expanding its herd to hundreds of cattle. But it was never just a business. It remained a haven for anyone in need. Serafina and Nicanor never forgot what it felt like to be desperate, hungry, or alone. Their door was always unlocked, and no weary traveler who stopped at their gate was ever turned away empty-handed. Decades passed peacefully. Nicanor and Serafina grew old together on the land they had saved, watching Jesse's children grow into fine young men and women who treated them as beloved grandparents. Toby went on to become a respected ranch foreman, and the cycle of poverty and despair that had once threatened to consume them all was broken forever by a single act of mercy. Sitting on the porch on a warm summer evening, watching the sun dip below the high ridge, the elderly couple sat side by side, their wrinkled hands intertwined. "It all started with a cup of water, didn't it?" Serafina murmured softly, leaning her head against Nicanor's shoulder. Nicanor smiled, kissing her silver hair gently. "It was the sweetest drink of water in the world, my love. It brought me home." Life has an extraordinary way of testing the human spirit. Sooner or later, every one of us faces seasons of profound loss, heart-wrenching loneliness, and moments when the dark seems entirely overwhelming. We lose people we love. We watch our cherished dreams crumble. And we are tempted to build high, impenetrable walls around our hearts to ensure we never get hurt again. We convince ourselves that isolation is safer than vulnerability, and that it is better to walk through the world feeling nothing at all than to risk loving and losing once more. Yet, as Serafina and Nicanor's journey reminds us, true healing never comes from locking ourselves away in the dark. It comes when we find the extraordinary courage to leave our doors unlocked, to extend a helping hand even when our own hearts are aching, and to offer mercy when the world tells us to demand retribution. When Serafina stood at her fence that dusty evening, she was exhausted and terrified, carrying 3 years of unspoken grief. She could have easily turned away from the dusty stranger at her gate. Nicanor, crushed by the loss of his family, could have kept riding down that endless Texas road, refusing to care about anyone ever again. And when Jesse came into the dark pasture to steal cattle out of sheer desperation, justice demanded he be met with violence. Instead, grace stepped in. A simple glass of cold water opened the door to trust. A second chance offered to a desperate father transformed a potential tragedy into a lifelong bond of loyalty and community. And two broken souls, who believed their capacity for joy had been buried forever in the soil of the past, discovered that love is not a limited resource that dies with our losses. It is an eternal spring that flows anew whenever we choose to open our hearts to another human being. For mature adults who have weathered the inevitable storms of life, this story carries a timeless truth. It is never too late for a second chapter. The losses we carry do not define the end of our story. They are simply the dark valleys that make the light ahead all the more precious. Kindness is never wasted. Forgiveness has the power to break generational curses, and sometimes the greatest blessings of our lives arrive when we least expect them, disguised as a tired traveler stopping at our gate, asking for nothing more than a little bit of water and a reason to keep going.